World Service Bulletin.
Hello and welcome to the Undisciplined podcast. It's your host as usual, Nico Beitendach. Today we have a great episode with Professor Sandro Mezzadra from the University of Bologna. I was fortunate enough to speak to him at the Critical Legal Conference that was held between 12 and 14 September in Perugia in Italy, where Professor Mezzadra was one of the keynote speakers, and he was kind enough to give a bit of his time to speak about his work. Professor Mezzadra is, of course, very well known. He has written numerous books. Most of our discussion centered around the book Barbarism Method, which he wrote with Brett Neilson, but he also wrote newer books in the meantime, namely In the Marxian Workshops, and his newest one that came out this year, again co-authored with Brett Neilson, called The Politics of Operations, and we discussed that book towards the end of the interview. It was a great interview, and thank you to Professor Mezzadra for speaking to me, and thank you for Giacomo Capuzzo at Perugia University for organizing the Critical Legal Conference. Everyone had a lot of fun. The presentations were interesting. It was a good conference, and please enjoy my conversation with Professor Sandro Mezzadra.
This tune is going out to Marconi, to all corners of the globe. There ain't no hut in the Serengeti.
Okay, thank you, Professor Mezzadra. So, I'd like to today just speak to you a little bit about your work and the books that you've written, and especially the Barbarism Method book, which has been very influential both in my own research and my own thinking in general.
Happy to hear that.
Yeah, it's a central part of my own PhD project too, international law, border regimes and so on. I know you've also written a few books since this one, so I apologize that
No worry.
this one is...
Just keep the conversation focused on Barbarism Method. I'm happy with that.
Okay, great. So, just to begin with, if we talk about Barbarism Method, what is the implication, the basic meaning of taking the Barbarism Method methodologically or epistemologically? How is that different or novel from previous approaches?
You know, a way to answer your question is very simple. Usually, border studies take the border as an object of investigation, and so they remain focused on the border in the literal meaning of the term. Taking the border both as an object of investigation, what we do in the book, and as a method or as an epistemic viewpoint allows to radically widen the scope of the investigation. It allows, for instance, to critically look at a whole set of concepts from the angle of the border. Citizenship, labor are, for instance, two concepts that we investigate in the book from the angle of the border. Many others could be added to those two. But taking the border as an epistemic viewpoint, as a method, also has implications for the way in which you look at the border understood as an object of investigation. It implies kind of destabilization of the border itself. You know, borders tend to present themselves as stable partitions, as lines traced on the sand and inscribed onto maps. Lines. To take the border not only as an object of investigation, but also as an epistemic viewpoint, things become more elusive, more complicated, and I would say also more interesting. And you can, for instance, track the proliferation of borders beyond the sight of the literal geopolitical border. You can investigate borders, the operations of borders, from the point of view of their heterogeneity. You can look at a specific geopolitical border, keeping in mind that there are several components of the border, not only the geopolitical one, but also, for instance, the cultural one, the linguistic one, the social one, and so on. And that these components are not necessarily most visible at the border, at the literal site of the border. So from this point of view, I would say that on the one hand, border as method allows widening the scope of border studies, and on the other hand, it compels to problematize the very notion of what a border is, to put it simply.
So this is also a claim from your book that borders are not only lines on maps or lines in the sand, but it's a kind of operation, and once we understand it in that way, we start seeing that instead of a globalized world without borders, actually this border procedure is multiplying, and we find it everywhere. And what is interesting to me is that, and now I'm perhaps coming from a Luhmannian perspective where the border is a method of reducing complexity, but you claim in the book, which is a claim that I agree with, you said that borders don't simply decode the world, which I would understand as reducing complexity, but you said it encodes the world, so it perhaps adds to the complexity.
No, that's a good point. I mean, that's a good point. Borders encode the world, first of all, in the sense that they produce parameters of legibility of the word, of readability of the word, and they fabricate the word, as we emphatically say in one of the chapters of the book, picking up this Latin phrase fabrica mundi that figures in the subtitle of Mercator's Atlas and played quite an important role at the origin of modern cartography. So this production of parameters of readability of the word, this production of frames of the word is a very important operation of borders. And you easily understand that this is also a cognitive kind of operation, in the sense that it corresponds to specific cognitive partitions. To put it in very simple words, for instance, the partition between civilization and barbarous spaces. But also, the kind of distinction between the West and the rest that was, of course, analyzed in a very effective, critical way by Stuart Hall, but was also a very important point at stake in Carl Schmitt's Der Nobel der Erde in 1950. And of course, following this train of thought, you can get to the point in which you discover that borders can also add to the complexity of the world, since they produce new partitions that are usually supposed to contribute to specific orders of the world, but that sometimes, first of all, because they are powerfully contested, add to the complexity of the world.
So you mentioned the distinction between civilization and barbarism, and you mentioned Carl Schmitt's Nomos der Erde. Now, one of the important claims for me in Nomos der Erde was the claim that the whole world had been discovered and the jus publicum Europaeum had become universalized, and that the world had no, or Europe had no outside left to conquer. So, given that that borders still somehow fulfill the function of creating the inside and outside, the civilization and barbarism, do you think that that can still be understood in a geographical sense, or should we understand it in a functional sense, or who are the new barbarians and who are the new Greeks today?
That's a very interesting question. I agree with the point you implicitly made asking the question, which means that today at the world level it is very difficult to trace absolute distinctions between inside and outside. Particularly if we take as a point of reference the overarching distinction between civilization and barbarism that was so important in early modern times to prompt and legitimize colonial expansion and conquest. Nowadays, you don't find the space of barbarism somewhere in the world. It is not possible to circumscribe that space and to consider it as an outside with respect to an inside that we call civilization. The main point is precisely that the distinction between civilization and barbarism has become blurred. That you find, quote and unquote, barbarism inside civilization. This is a point that we make in the book, not only with respect to the difference between civilization and barbarism, but also with respect to a whole set of binaries that continue to be usually employed in order to make sense of the world order and disorder. For instance, global north and global south, or center and periphery, to speak the language of world system theory. So it's clear that we cannot contend that geography does not matter anymore, that there is no difference anymore between different parts of the world, to put it simply. But what we contend, and I think it is an important point in Borderless method, is that such binaries do not anymore organize a stable geography at the world level. It is difficult to trace on a map the boundaries between the global north and the global south, between center and periphery, because also center and periphery, in a way, multiplies. And you find center and periphery in India, to make an important example. So does it make sense to ask whether India is a periphery? Well, I don't know. Does it make sense to ask whether China belongs to the global south? I think it is an obscuring question, a misleading question. A question that does not really help us to understand what is going on, at the global level, in the global turmoil we are currently experiencing. So your question is really an important question, and I think we need kind of new conceptual tools in order to make sense of what I was calling before, what we call also in the book the current global turmoil.
Also, one of the sources that you draw upon in your book is on Günter Teubner, and he talks about more specialized regimes and that the law can at best try to manage the relationships between these different regimes and conflicts between the regimes. On the one hand, I'm sympathetic to such a project. On the other hand, I'm wondering, I almost think about it as an algorithm that repeats itself. Would that not be the logic or algorithm of the border distinction just be re-entering itself? And instead of managing this process, we're accelerating it in some sense. Wouldn't this create even more complexity and make the problem even more difficult for us to manage?
Günter Teubner has a kind of interesting approach, in my opinion. He has an approach with specific normative implications. Brett and I are not that much interested in such normative implications. We take Teubner, if I may put it so, as a cartographer of global law. And we are particularly interested in the way in which we can speak today of global law. I will put it in simple terms, once again, from the point of view of international law. It doesn't matter whether you are following Schmidt or Kelsen. Then what you will be looking for is simply the vanishing of international borders. That will be your main parameter in order to understand the emergence of a global law. Günter Teubner invites us to shift our gaze. Following the long tradition of legal pluralism he builds upon, he invites us to look at the emergence of partial, sectoral legal orders that have no national basis. He invites us to look at the multiplication of such partial legal orders. And you are right, the multiplication of partial legal orders implies a multiplication of borders. But these are borders that are quite different from the international ones. So it's not by accident, for instance, that Teubner and other legal scholars follow his lead, hark back to conflict law, specifically understood as a tool to manage frictions between legal boundaries, between the legal boundaries that kind of circumscribe, enable the operations of sectorial, partial legal orders. This seems to me particularly interesting. And we have looked at border regimes also from this point of view. And I think we have been able to test Teubner's approach. We re-elaborate it a bit, of course, but we have been able to test the effectiveness of approach against the background of the working of the actual working of border regimes.
So to shift it a little bit, but not too much, and I know this is in your book, but what do you think is the future of the nation state? This is very wild, but you walk a line between sovereignty and governmentality in the book, but where does that leave the nation state? You don't go all the way in either direction. How do you see that balance?
It's a wide question. Of course, an important question, but it is also a very difficult question to answer. I have to say that the situation today, September 2019, is already quite different from the situation in which Brett and I wrote Borderless Method. It was 2011, 2012. It is quite different precisely from the point of view of your question, because nowadays we are witnessing kind of surge of a new nationalism at the global level, which is not to be reduced to the West. It's not Salvini in Italy, Johnson in the UK, Trump in the US. Just think of Turkey, just think of Egypt, just think of Modi's India. And we could also mention Russia and China in the age of Xi Jinping. So I really think it is a kind of global constellation we are currently living through. And of course, this constellation raises several questions regarding the future of the nation state. My impression is that there is a huge tension between such political developments as the ones I have just mentioned and what is going on the ground if you look at the actual working of contemporary capitalism. Capitalism today is producing its own spaces. After publishing Borderless Method, Brett and I have been working for several years now on logistics, for instance. And the critical literature on logistics invites you to look at this continuous production of space by capital, a production of space that exists in tension with national spaces and borders. Of course, if you look at specific borders from the point of view of migration today, a point of view that is prominent in our book, well, the tendency toward the hardening of border is apparent. It is apparent in the Mediterranean Sea, it is apparent at the border between the US and Mexico, but also elsewhere, in the world. For instance, in India, once again. So, my impression is that we are living through a kind of transition in which the tension I was just mentioning can also be understood in terms of tension between sovereignty and governance. To go back to the question that you were asking and that we analyze in Borderless Method. Logistics, in a way, can be analyzed from the angle of governance. The way in which logistical spaces are regulated and governed has much more to do with the phenomenology provided by the literature of governance than with sovereignty. So, I repeat, we are living through this kind of transition, we are living through these multifarious tensions, and it's difficult to say which will be the outcome of the tension. To conclude, in the book we are very careful not to say the nation state is going to disappear. What we try to do in the book is to map the huge transformations of the nation state in the framework of global processes, to put it quickly. And I think this continues to be kind of effective analytical framework, although it must be a flexible framework, capable to register the shifts in these tensions.
So you say a lot has changed in the 6, 7, 8 years since you wrote this book, and that today we see an increase in nationalism. Do you think that the function or process of bordering that you saw here has somehow contributed to this increase in nationalism that we see now? The procedure of bordering, has that encoded the way that people perceive their role within the nation state?
Yeah, I don't know. Let's see. From one point of view, I would say that the kind of border regime that we analyze in border as method has become a target of nationalist propaganda. And I am thinking of humanitarianism. In the book, we analyze a situation in which humanitarianism has been incorporated into the working of border regimes. And we look at this shift of humanitarianism, at this governmental turn of the humanitarian reason, trying to shed light on the tensions and contradictions, even on the potentialities that it inscribe onto the working of the border regime. Nowadays, we are confronted with a criminalization of humanitarianism. We'll see, which development we will be confronted with in the future. But nowadays, look at the Mediterranean, look at the borderlands, at the desert between the US and Mexico. There is an important collective based in Arizona, No More Deaths. They have been criminalized for disseminating bottled waters along migrant routes in the desert. Criminalized. It's even more striking than the criminalization of NGOs who perform rescue operations in the Mediterranean. The battle of waters. So, from this point of view, a point that we make in the book, we are not the only ones to make it, is that border regimes have to negotiate tensions and contradictions between different imperatives. We look at least at 4 imperatives: security, humanitarianism, economic valorization of migration, and demography. And we try to track such imperatives in the actual working of border regimes, in the actors that compose specific border regimes. Well, nowadays, security, national security, is definitely the overwhelming imperative, and humanitarianism has been pulled outside, has been expelled from the border regime in many parts of the world. I repeat, we'll see what will happen in the future. We have not to take this as a kind of crystallized situation, But nowadays we are confronted with an expulsion of humanitarianism. And even if you think of economic valorization of migration, which means, to put it in very short ways, the interest of capital in the management of borders, well, it is also subordinated to national security in an unprecedented way. And it is clear, that in many parts of the world, the US, in Italy, in Germany, there are capitalist actors, important capitalist actors, who are not at all happy with the kind of evolution of the border regime that I am talking about. Think of, to come back more directly to your question, think of the main slogan of the Brexit campaign. We have to take back national control of our borders. So it's clear that a certain assemblage of the border regime has become a target of nationalist propaganda.
Professor, so you also have a new book that came out this year called The Politics of Operations. Again, just as Border's Method, you co-authored it with Brett Neilson. Do you mind just briefly telling me what that book is all about?
Well, it's again a book that I wrote with Brett Neilson. So this is the first element of continuity. The answer is yes and no. There is a strong continuity with Border's method from the point of view of the method of research and writing. There is a continuity from the point of view of our interest in what we call in Border's method actually existing global processes, but you will not find many references to the question of the border, to the question of migration in the politics of operations. In the politics of operations, we tackle in a very direct way the question of capitalism. What is contemporary capitalism? Which are the defining features of contemporary capitalism that make it a kind of specific capitalist formation. We do that through an analysis of three domains of economic activity that are interlaced, but that we analyze quite in detail in the book. The first one is extraction, the extractive sector, mines, but also extensive agriculture. The second domain is logistics. I was mentioning it before, and we look at logistics, from the point of view of transport systems and supply chains, but also from the point of view of cutting-edge developments, such as, for instance, platform labor. And the third domain is finance. So we try to let our analysis of those three domains resonate in order to discern kind of logic that is driving contemporary operations of capital. We expand quite a bit on this notion of operations of capital. To put it shortly, the point we make is that capitalism today is more and more characterized by an extractive logic. In order to make this point, we also forge an expanded notion of extraction, not limited to extraction in the literal sense of the word, but also capable to come to grips with the actual working of finance, for instance. Another important focus of the book is, a vexed question, the relation between capital and the state. And in order to tackle this vexed question in a relatively original way, we kind of challenge the prevailing notion of the state, which means that we discuss the Weberian notion of the state. We do not want to get rid of that notion. We simply ask, are there other experiences of the state, other figures of the state, other state formations in modern history that can help us more in understanding current formations of state and capital. So we look at the history of colonization, and we focus in particular on two important, say, political but also legal formations that are chartered companies and the concession. And so if you look at the chartered companies and the concession, particularly at chartered companies, you will see kind of intertwining between economic and political interests, a kind of direct political protagonism of commercial actors that in a way challenge the idea of a clear-cut separation between politics and economy. And the Weberian notion of the state is predicated upon such a separation. So we look at the re-emergence of this. We work quite a lot on chartered companies in particular, above all on the East India Company. Because we had this idea, maybe the history of the East India Company allows us to understand better what's going on in the city of London today, And so then I was one day I was looking at a book by Gayatri Spivak because I had to find a quotation for the lecture, and I found a passage that I had totally forgotten where she made the same point, some 15 years before, this critique of post-colonialism. So this is the outline of the book, just to give an idea. I will speak more about that in the lecture later.
I look forward to it. Yes, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you for your time.
It was a pleasure.